Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation. Today we are going to be walking through the advanced form management project using Formik and Yup. So today's project, the idea is that we need to create a form that accepts a user's name, email, password, a checkbox to accept the terms of service, and then a button to send that data to a server. We also need to validate the form. We want to make sure that the user is entering valid data. That validation will also be done on the back end if there were a real back end for this project. But doing it on the front end provides a better user experience for our users because they get immediate feedback before they try to submit a form and then the server returns an error. To ship our data off to a server, we use a POST request, which most of you will be familiar with through going through build weeks, but we use GET requests to get data from the server. We use a POST request to post data to the server. And then we want to display the data returned to our screen, which is surprisingly tricky due to the realities of using Formik, but we'll get through it. Okay, so I have just a blank create React app. I have already done the legwork of adding Formik, Yup, and Axios as dependencies. So I'm not going to do that now, but if you're following along at home, you do have to do that. Okay, so I just have my bare app here. I am going to create a new component, and I'm going to call it form. So let's make a file called form.js. I'm going to import React from React, and I'm going to make my component just like normal. I'm going to call it form, although we'll see why that may have to change later. I'm going to take in props, and I'm just going to return a div for now, and then I'm going to export default form. Great. So then now I can, in my app.js, import my form. Import form from /form.js. I didn't put it inside of a folder or anything like that. And then I can render my form. And nothing shows up, but I can add some text in here to check and see. Yay, it works. It works. Okay. So if we were making a traditional form, we would do something like form, and I would have an input, type equals text, name is equal to name, placeholder is equal to name, and then I do a similar thing for email, and for password as well. Oop, what did I just do? I didn't do the thing that I wanted to do. I want to replace all occurrences of email with password on this line. There we go. And so now we get a form with our fields in it, but I have to go through the legwork of, setting up our state and handle change, and then if I wanted to do any kind of validation, it's like, I have to start, building out a pretty complex structure for what should be something that I want to reuse frequently. I want to make a lot of forms. That's most of what we do in front-end development is make forms. So we have libraries that solve these problems. If you encounter the same problem over and over again and find yourself writing the same code over and over again, then chances are there's some pattern that can be abstracted into a tool that you can reuse. Whether that's, a component or something a bit more complicated like Formik. So Formik allows us to make forms very similar to the way we have previously, but to do the heavy lifting when it comes to managing that state for us and then providing additional features that go along with that. To get started, I am going to import some stuff from Formik. I'm going to import form, and I'm going to import field from Formik. And we run into an initial problem here, which is that this form from Formik and my form are the same name. If I wanted to, I could rename this form using the as syntax inside of my named imports. I could call this maybe Formik form, and that would be good. But I want to emphasize that this is a banana name. Form is something that I can call whatever I want. So I'm just going to call this form comp because I'm not very creative. And notice that nothing bad has happened, even though I'm still calling it form in app.js. That's because when we have these default exports, we can import this default thing as whatever we want. So I could call this, the form I need. And I just have to reference it with that same name wherever I use it. So traditionally, we try to name our imports the same as the export and have that be the name of, whatever function or class we make our component, but that doesn't have to match. So I'm going to leave it as form in app.js, and I'm just going to call it form comp, or form, I'll just spell it out. Let's call it form component inside of the actual form.js. So now I have my things from Formik. In our experience with most component libraries, like Semantic UI, is that these are just drop-in replacements, right? I should be able to replace my form with my capital form and my inputs with this field. Okay, so now we get this error. Suddenly, this .props.formik.register field is not a function. Oops. So, the reason is because Formik is going to do the heavy lifting for us in terms of managing state. And it does so inside of its own component, essentially. And then it passes down, the state variables as props to our form component, as well as any functions that the form component needs to update the values of these fields, for example. Right now, our form component isn't connected to anything. That's why I also need to import with Formik, which is a function that will hook up my form component to kind of the Formik backend, which is going to contain all of the state management stuff, and then it's going to pass that down via props. I want to talk a bit about the language that we've been using in regards to things like with Formik and higher order component and stuff like that, because these are just my opinions, but I think there's a lot of confusion in this area where there doesn't necessarily need to be. Because we use terms like higher order component when we're working with Formik. So we use it, we save the output into a variable, and we call with Formik, and it takes this weird syntax where it takes two sets of arguments. But with Formik isn't a higher order component. It's a function, right? It's a function that takes a component as an argument, and it produces a component as output. That's all it is. A higher order component isn't anything spooky. Like, imagine if my form component accepted a component as props and it rendered like props dot some component. That's a higher order component right there. It's a component that accepts a component as an argument. That's what we mean by higher order. When we talk about a higher order function, it's a function that accepts another function as an argument. So what we're doing when we use this with Formik function is it's going to wrap the component we've given it inside of another component that manages state and then renders our form component and passes it down prompts. Where have we seen this behavior before? With React Router. Right? Our our route component is a higher order component. Because route, we put configuration on, we give it a path, and then we also give it a component that we want to render. This is a higher order component. It takes a component as an argument, as a prop, and then it wraps it in some other stuff, and it produces this route component, and then it performs conditional rendering for us. When we use this with Formik, it's an incredibly similar pattern to what we're using with route, but we're using this function instead. And this function will essentially do the same thing that route does. It will take in a component, it will put some stuff around it, it will pass it props, route passes our component, match, history, and all of that. And this with Formik will produce a component that will pass our form component all the state variables it needs for all the field values and all the functions to handle updating, those things on changes. There is another syntax with Formik that looks much more like route. There is a component called Formik. And instead of giving all of the arguments that we would give to with Formik, we can give them as props to the Formik component. And you can look that up. I'm not going to go over it today. But it might connect more with your previous experience with higher order components, this big spooky term, which is just things like route, where it takes a component and does some additional stuff with it. However, I like this pattern of with Formik because this is going to match up to some of the stuff we'll see next week with state management solutions. So, any questions so far? I know I haven't really done anything yet. Okay. Well then, I'm going to keep moving forward. So, we need to connect our form component with Formik so that Formik can provide it the state variables as props and all the functions it needs to work. And so what we do is this with Formik function accepts this weird double set of arguments, which isn't as spooky as it may seem. The function signature of with Formik is that it's a function that takes some args, and then what it does, it returns another function that takes more args. That's why we have these two sets of arguments. The first time we call it, the output is a function. And the second time we call it, with this second set of arguments, the output is going to be a component. So if you look up things like partial application and currying, you'll see this pattern more. And we'll see it again next week as well. This first set of arguments is going to take some various configuration options to set up, to set up our component when it connects to Formik. So we're going to define some various functions. The first one being map props to values. We do this by giving an object as the argument to with Formik, and within this object we're going to define the various keys and their values that we need. So the first one is going to be map props to values. And what this expects is a function that is going to take in an object full of all of the values, and then it expects us to map that onto the props that we are going to give our component. So these are going to match up to the names that we've put on our field. So I'm going to have one called name, I'm going to have one called email, and I'm going to have one called password. Similar to when we did our form management ourselves, we would use event.target.name to reference a key within the object. Formik does the exact same thing. So I'm going to destructure my arguments here just because I really like this pattern. So I'm going to get name, I'm going to get email, and I'm going to get password. And then what I need to do is I need to decide how I want to modify these when they're passed in to my my component. And we wouldn't really need to do anything, except we have to choose the initial values. Because name initially is going to be null. It's going to be undefined. It's not going to have a value. And when we have a managed form, as some of you may have experienced, if the value that you set is null or undefined, and then you suddenly switch it to be, some string, some value that exists, you get this error in your console about, switching managed form. So all I want to do is I want to decide that my props object, this thing, is going to have a key called name, and it's going to accept name. If name doesn't exist, this name I'm getting from my arguments, then I want it to be an empty string. And I'm going to repeat with email and password. And when I need to add more stuff, I'm going to need to do that as well. Okay. So we have that set up now. We should be passing all the props that we need from Formik down into our form component, but my error hasn't changed. Does anyone know why? This is something that I bet a lot of you did accidentally yesterday. So I'm still getting this error about, my component not having Formik stuff hooked up to it, but I did it right here. And I hooked up my component to Formik. But then what I'm not doing is using the output of hooking up my component to Formik. Because the output of calling with Formik is this new component that I've decided to call Formik form. What am I exporting? Well, oh, are people talking and I can't hear them? Oh no! Zoom, you gotta be kidding me. Shoot. Okay. Could anyone repeat themselves?
Can you hear?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah, we need to export it.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. Okay. Zoom, sometimes when I launch it, it likes to set its volume to 10%, just like once every 10 times I open Zoom. So I don't... gosh. How much did I ignore people speaking so far?
Only one time.
Okay, good. Oh. Well, thank you, Kevin, for calling me out in the chat. Yeah, so we need to export it because I'm not doing anything with the Formik form that I produced. So now our form is set up and we have it hooked up, and we can type in here and Formik will manage all of that for us. You can see it's already pitching a fit because this isn't an email. And notice I'm going to console log props, which is something that I hope all of you did yesterday, because there's some magic, or at least what seems like magic, happening. And none of it is really hidden from us. So let's see what props is in our console. So if we look, it's suddenly a huge object full of all of this stuff. And these are all the props that Formik is passing down into our form component, similar to how route passes down, history and match and location. But we have a ton of stuff here. Some of it is things like the values. These are the values of the forms that I've typed into, and notice how they're updated to with what I typed in there. But then we also have all of these various functions, which will, trigger changes in the state of Formik, and then that will change the props that are passed down to us. We have a bunch of other things here. But let's go and let's build out the rest of our form. So what were our requirements? We needed a name, an email, a password, a terms of service checkbox, and then a submit button. So we can do that. Let's see. So I have name, email, password, and now I'm going to want a checkbox. It's going to be another field. The type this time is going to be checkbox. So notice how I have type text, email, and password. These are actually all types on normal inputs in normal HTML. You can get the default behavior of like it will yell at you if it's not an email if you set type email on an input in your HTML. And if you do type password, that's how we get these little black dots to appear when we type the password in instead of the actual text. And that's just the default behavior on the input form. And so now we're going to set our type to be checkbox. I'm going to call this maybe TOS for terms of service. And now I have a little checkbox. But there's going to be a bit of a usability issue where, okay, so my checkbox doesn't have any text. Let me add some text. Agree to TOS. Where when I click, I have to manage to hit this small little box. And most of the time, people are going to expect to be able to kind of hit this whole region and have it hit the terms of service. So I want to be able to click on this text and have it trigger this box. The easy fix is to wrap our text and our field inside of a label. And now I can click on the text and that will hit my checkbox as well. So yay, now we have a good text box. So we also need a button. So let's add a button. Its type of submit, and I'll just have it say submit. So now we have our basic form. It's really ugly. I'm going to style it just a smidge so that it's like not all on one line. So if you want to style this with normal CSS, remember at the end of the day, what appears in our browser is HTML. And we can look and see that this is just a form with some inputs. It's a label tag. There's a button. So nothing is stopping me from going into, let's say, my app.css and then targeting my forms and doing something like width, 80%, max width. Let's do like 500 pixels, padding 15 pixels, margin 0 auto. I'm going to make this actually like 30 pixels, and then display flex, flex direction, column, and oh, I did dot form. This is not a class. I am just targeting the form directly. Yay, there we go. And I can also just hit up those input things, and I can do, let's do margin, 10 pixels, 0. There we go. And now I just have some basic form styling. Because our browser is going to display HTML, the CSS is going to target that HTML. It all works. We also could have set class names on things if we wanted to, but I didn't. So now we have our all of our stuff set up. At this point, I think let's do validation before we do submission, because I don't want to send data that's wrong to my server that I can know is wrong, at least from the get-go. The way we're going to do that is by adding another function to our Formik, to our with Formik. So this is what gets used when we're mapping our values and props onto one another. What I want to do is I want to add another key to this object, this time called validation schema. And here's where I'm going to use yup, because yup gives me a nice, essentially little language to describe the requirements of my values that they have to meet. It's kind of like the testing we saw today. This just gives us a great way to describe the shape that these values need to be in without resorting to parsing the text directly ourselves with regular expressions or things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to import yup, which we do with this star syntax, import star as yup from yup. This can be lowercase, this can be uppercase. I saw some confusion about this yesterday. We can call this whatever we want, because essentially what I'm doing is I say import all of the stuff that yup is exporting and then just put it into an object for me that you call this, because yup, it's going to export a ton of stuff with this named thing, and I don't want to import all of those manually. So what I can do is just say, all right, grab all of that and then bundle it up into an object for me. So, works. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify my schema. So I do this by saying yup.object.shape, because what I'm saying here is that I want to check an object's shape. I want to describe what each one of the values inside this object is going to look like. And we know from our console log of the props that all of our values are collected into this big object, where each of their keys is the value of each thing in the form. So let's look in our console and let's double check that. So we see that our values are this object, and we have name, email, password. If I click this box, where are we? There we go. Now we also see terms of service in there, and we'll deal with things not showing up in there in just a minute. So we have this set up, and now let's try to validate it. So I want to first validate my name. I'm going to do this by using yup again, and I'm going to use the language that yup gives me to describe what I want my name to look like. It's going to be a string. Do I have any other requirements on my name? Not really. It's just got to be a string. I would encourage all of you to read many of the horror stories about trying to put requirements on names and how people's actual names will quickly destroy any of your preconceptions of, what a name is, how many names people should have, how many letters a name needs. There are also many horror stories of, a man whose last name is literally Null, N-U-L-L, and how he's not allowed to sign up for lots of online services because Null isn't a valid value for the name field. So my name, it's got to be a string, and it's required, and I can provide to any of these tests an error message, where if it doesn't meet it, then it's going to display that the name is not valid. So a man has a name. But if I go and do stuff in here, I'm not going to see that error message, because Formik, in its infinite wisdom, provides me with the values of the errors when we do validation, but it lets me do what I choose with them. If I want to display them all at the top of my form, if I only want to display, the most recent one, if I want to display them next to each one of these inputs, these are all decisions that I get to make, which is actually pretty nice of Formik. So let's go through, and let's do email as well. So I'm going to do yup.string. My email has to be a string. It also needs to be an email, which is one of these built-in things that yup can already detect for us. If you look for yup documentation, which is something you all should do when you use a library for the first time, you will see that in the GitHub, all of these things are pretty obliquely documented here. We can just see the entire yup API. So for strings, we have, okay, we can check and see if it's a URL, an email, if it matches something, min, max, length, uppercase, lowercase. We got all of it. So I'm going to check and see if it's an email, and if not, I'm going to say you gotta have an email. And let's also make it required. And you really need it. Let's see. Password. It's also going to be a string. And let's just give it a length requirement. So it's got to be at least, let's do 4 characters to reduce the amount of typing I have to do. And say password must be at least 4 characters long. And then let's also make it required and say password is required. And so we can put these different error strings on the different requirements because someone may have typed a password. And so the requirement, this line has been fulfilled. They have a value in the password, but the minimum length requirement isn't fulfilled. So it will show this error message instead of this one, which is pretty cool. Generally, these are always going to be passed as the argument that comes after whatever additional pieces of information that, you know, min or max or whatever is going to require. And then let's also do terms of service. In this case, it's not going to be a string. It's going to be a Boolean, which is what we call the true or false value. And I'm going to make it required. And the problem is that if it's required, then it has to have a value. And what are valid Boolean values? Well, true, false, undefined, null. So even if someone hasn't put it in there, it's going to fulfill this requirement. So I have to describe the acceptable values because they have to check it. They don't just have to be aware that the box is there and choose not to check it. So I use another one of my yup functions. This is going to be one of, where I require that this value be one of the items that I put inside of this array that I give them the first argument. So it has to be true. And then you gotta. Okay. So, this should be required, not require. I make that mistake constantly. Because require is another keyword that appears in languages. So we've added all of our values to our validation schema. But notice I forgot to add my TOS to this map props to values. So I am going to do that. So let me add my TOS, and I will get it as an argument and destructure it here. And in this case, I don't really need to give it a default value because it being null or undefined or whatever is just fine. I could make it false by default if I wanted it to, you know, have a strict value in there, which I will, but that actually isn't required in this case. If I wanted to, watch this, I could make it true. Or no, does it not work that way? Well, guess it doesn't. So ignore that. Okay. So now we have all of these things going through validation. We're mapping all their values into props that we're giving to our form. Do we have any questions at this point? Now I'm paranoid and I'm going to check the levels on Zoom again. Any questions? I think I can hear someone chewing.
Test, test.
Yeah, I can hear you, Carlos. All right, cool. So no questions. I'm going to keep moving. So let's return to our console log, because I want to see the other prompts that are being passed to me as I type in this form and fail my tests. So if we look in our console, we've been logging props this whole time. In addition to our values object, we're going to get another object called errors. And this is going to display the various errors. So, for example, my email has failed. I gotta have an email. My password has to be at least 4 characters long, and I gotta check the terms of service. I just gotta. So we can display those on our component however we choose to do. Often we'll do something like how do I want to do this? Because I want to do it wrong first. Yeah, so we'll check and see if the error exists for this field. So let's do props.errors.name. And then if that exists, I'm going to use my AND operator, because this is like the first half of my ternary. If this is true, then do the right-hand side, which I'm just going to make a little p tag and give it a class name of error, and then have its contents be props.errors.name. So we're going to see right off the gate that nothing shows up, but name is probably a bad one to do. There we go. So now we see a man has a name. And I can repeat this with my email. So let me change all instances of name to email, and then put this in the right place. So, some weird stuff is happening, which is as I click around, as soon as the parsing occurs, as I type into my name, suddenly I get the error for my email. Because as soon as I try to start giving Formik values, it will run that entire values object through the validation. And then it will produce any errors that come up. So we can see, as I start typing in my name, we run into an error on my email. But I haven't typed in there yet. So it provides a bad experience for our users to see errors pop up in things that they haven't gotten to yet. So one thing we can do is we can check another object that Formik has given us. If we look in our console log, we're going to see, where is it? This touched object. And this is going to contain as keys all of the inputs that the user has interacted with. So we can use this to tell, has the user like tried to put in an email and then just stopped, in which case we should probably give them the error message, or have they not touched it at all and we shouldn't display the error message. So we can add this to our chain of ands. So I want to check and see if props.touched.name exists before I check on the error and do anything else. The same with props.touched.email. So I want to check and see if they've tried to interact with that email input before I give them any errors about it. Now I can type in name, and I don't get any of my email errors. If I type in an email and then move, now touched is true, and suddenly I get my error for my email. This is also getting pretty verbose. I keep doing props.touch, props.errors. I'm going to use these a lot. In the case that I am using these a lot, I like to destructure my props. So I'm going to get my my values, my touched, and errors into their own variables by destructuring them from props. And then I can remove all references to props dot here. And that's going to work exactly the same. I've just shortened up my code just a smidge. And we can continue and do the same thing for our password. So I'm going to change all occurrences of email into password. And then we'll do the same thing with our checkbox. change all instances of password into TOS. And there we go. Yay, I gotta. Password's good. Password's bad. Email's bad. Name is fine, as long as I have one. Otherwise, name is bad. So now I have all of my my validation working and those error messages showing up in my form. Do we have any questions at this point?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I read somewhere on the internet, like UX design, like you want to have the label for the form, like not like separately from where they're typing, so that like people know what to type in the middle of typing something, like the label.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, you probably should have that. I just don't because I'm just doing a minimal example. Because like right now to the user, this is utter nonsense. Like what is this? Oh, I'd say email here, but like that's bad. Like the checkbox has this agree to terms of service label. I should probably add these labels to each one of my fields so that the user can know what they're typing into. I just took a shortcut here. But yeah, that is a great question. All right, any other questions? Okay, well then let's send our data to the server. So normally we would put an onSubmit handler on this form, but now we are using a Formik form. And Formik is going to take care of handling those submit events for us. But we need to tell it how we want those to be handled. So you guessed it, we are going to add another key to this essentially configuration object that we give Formik. So after my validation, I'm going to make another one called, let me look at my notes here. Is it just handle submit? It is. Handle submit. And this is going to be a function which is going to take in some stuff. It's going to take in some stuff, and we'll talk about it. But in here, I can do whatever I want. What arguments we're going to be given, the first one is going to be that values object, which is great. And then the second one is going to be an object full of a ton of stuff. I believe it's called the Formik bundle in the documentation. And you can go and look up and see all of the neat things that are given to you. For now, do I need anything out of here? Yeah. There's one function that is provided to us in this bundle called reset form, which is pretty neat. Some of you have seen in these previous videos, whenever I've done submitting my form, I zero out all of my values manually. But with this reset form function, Formik will handle taking everything back to its initial value for us once we have once we're done with doing whatever we want in our submission. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios because I'm going to make my post request. So I'm going to do axios.post and then post up to our fake API, which is https request.in/API/users. And the way a post request works in Axios, very similar to GET. First, we give it the URL of the endpoint we want to hit. But in post, we send data to the server. And we give that as the second argument. So I'm going to give it the values. We handle our then and our catch the exact same way as we do with a GET request. If it's successful, it's going to give us back a response object. I'm going to console log the response object, and then I'm also going to call the reset form function, which will clear out my form. If we get an error, then for now, I'll just console log that error. Okay. So, I'm also going to put a console log here. Request. Just so we can see everything happening. And I'm going to temporarily comment out my console log of props because that's going to flood my console with things. Okay. So now I'm all set up to submit my form. One neat thing we get for free is the form won't submit unless it's valid. So if I put my name in and then I hit submit, it's just going to trigger all of these error messages and not actually try to submit my form. If I fill them out correctly-ish, and then submit my form, we'll see that we start our request, we make our request, and we get this response object back from the server. We get a status code of 201, which means successful, like 200, but also that we've created some data, and they give us, a bunch of information back. It included all of the stuff we sent them with an ID added on and a created at time. And this is very similar to a response you'd get back from a real server when you post data to create a user or something like that. And so that was successful. And we see now my form is cleared out because I called this handy dandy reset form function, which just went and reset my form. So there's other things we can do within here based on the functions that are given to us inside of this Formik bundle. Our next goal with this form is to be able to display the data that the server sends back to us. And normally what we would do is in our onSubmit event, we would, set some state variable to contain the response from that server. But I don't have access to any state variables inside my form component. So initially, at least, I'm a little stuck on how to handle this. If
Hey, Henry,
yes.
The bundle you mentioned, that's the Formik bag, correct?
Oh, Formik bag, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's what it's called. That's what you're referring to, right?
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. I just blanked on the name. Yes, that object that they give us is called the Formik bag, not the Formik
Gotcha.
bundle.
I just want to make sure we're thinking about the same thing, because if there was another bundle I didn't know about, I would have freaked out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I was like, I know it starts with a B, and I used Formik for the first time yesterday, so.
Nice. Dude, you got it down.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, read the documentation and stuff. That's what I did. And you'll learn all of these neat things. Like, we can look up handle submit. Yeah, and the second argument is called Formik bag. So the Formik bag contains all of these functions. All of these functions. And the one we want to be able to handle data coming back from our server is called set status. And what this does is there's a special variable that's passed in as a prop to our component called status. And its value by default is null or undefined, but we can change its value with set status. So this is an easy way for us to communicate between these functions that we're giving to our Formik configuration and our component. Because status is going to be passed down as a prop, we can set the value of status, so suddenly now I have a way to communicate with my component. So what I can do is not only console log res, but I can set status res. And we'll see set status isn't defined because it isn't. I have to get it out of the Formik bag. And in this case, I'm doing it via destructuring. So I'm going to get that set status function. And then now let me add my console log back in. And we can see that when I submit my form, once it's done, we get our response back, and then the form is going to re-render. And now when we check the props object that our form is receiving, we should see that status is still undefined. Wait, what? I think we may have had issues with how frequently I'm console logging. Yeah, because here's the correct status. Status is now this object that we got back from the API. So there's our status. So we can use this to manage our local state inside this component. So I should probably separate this out into another component, but I'm not going to. So do what I say and not what I do. I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to import useState from React, and then I'm going to create some state variables. It's going to be called users. And set users, and its initial value is going to be an empty array. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put it at the end of my form. Shh, don't tell anyone. This is terrible practice. So then I'm going to map over users, and then for each user, I'm going to be very lazy. I'm just going to create a div that contains a JSON.stringified version of the user object. But here you could map through it and create components. And you could do this in your app.js and pass the state down and follow all the good practice, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. So now what we can do is we can add the contents of the status prop to this array. But I don't want to be doing that constantly on every re-render. I don't want to do something like, let me get status out of my props. I don't want to do something like set users, and then add status on the end of it, because this is going to run every single time my component is re-rendered. What I want to do is I want to run this sometimes. What do we do when we want to run code sometimes? That's our use effect. So what I can do is write a use effect and append status onto set users. And I want to do this every time the value of status changes. But I'm also going to check in here if status is defined, because status is going to flip between undefined and not constantly whenever we don't have its value set, and then we set its value, and it actually resets, I believe, on the next re-render. So this way, whenever the value of status changes and it's also a thing and not nothing, we append it to the end of our users array. Let's test this out. Let's give us a name, give it a password, agree to my terms of service, and then when I submit, that shows up down here, and it's yelling at me because I don't have a key set on the map. So why don't we do that real fast? Set the key to be user.id. And there we go. That's how we get data from our handle submit into our component. So do we have any questions here?
Yeah, you said best case to do the use state and use effect in a separate component.
Not the use effect, the use state.
So how would we do that exactly?
Okay, I can do that real fast, because the idea is this form doesn't really concern itself with displaying users. That's probably something that should be done in another component. So this is a pretty easy fix. I just have to do it in my app.js, for example. So here I'm going to import useState, and instead of storing the users inside of my form component, I'm going to store them in app. So users, set users, useState, an empty array, and I spelled this wrong. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass a function down to my form that adds a user to the state. So I'll just define a function called addUser. It's going to take in a user, and then what it's going to do is it's going to call setUsers, and it's going to append a user onto my users. And now I can pass this as a prop to my form. Add user is going to be equal to add user. So then I can rip out this because that's not really relevant. And I can replace set users with prompts.addUser and give it status, which is going to contain a new user object. Technically an entire status object. I should probably change that to res.data. And then I don't want to map over my users here. I'm going to do that inside of my app.js. So, come on, React. I believe in you. Yes. So now, let me fire up a new one. So now essentially the same thing occurs, but we're now keeping track of the users within app instead of doing it inside of our form component. We still need the use effect here because this is what we do to determine, whether or not we should be adding a user that we're getting back from our form submission. But actually tracking the users and displaying them should be the purview of another component if we're splitting up our responsibilities correctly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, Henry, I DM'd you about this all earlier, but with my component, I'm doing the same thing by adding the status to the users array using a class component.
Mm-hmm.
And I still can't figure out like the condition to prevent it from updating infinitely. And I have, I'm just like stuck. I can share my screen or you can just write it out, whatever you feel is best.
It should be something like this. Basically copying our use effect. So in component did update, we'll check and see if this .props.status exists, and if this .props.status does not equal prevprops.status. And if that is the case, then you would trigger whatever function is going to add the user onto your array. I believe this works. One of the things that can get tricky is when we compare the equality of two objects in JavaScript, it doesn't behave the way we often expect it to, which it doesn't compare the contents. Even if the contents of two objects are identical, if they're not the same object in memory, then we get false. So if props is an object and this is failing, then you might have to check something inside of here that you know to be unique between these two occurrences. But I believe this should work.
Yeah, I think this one works. That's how I made it work. But I have a question. So originally, I used component update, but I just checked for the status without using previous props and previous state, right? Which is probably not the correct way, right? Because it could just work. You could just check for status directly. You don't need to, check previous or current. But then that's how this method should work, right? Is this still a right way?
Yeah. So
if I use previous props just so that I can use them because I don't really need to.
I believe, if I'm understanding, I do not know the implementation of Formik. I just played around with it a little bit yesterday. So I believe the way that status works is when we call set status, it will trigger a re-render where status is given as a prop to our component, and our component does whatever it needs with it. And then immediately another re-render is triggered where status is then set back to undefined or null. So we can basically check to see if it's changing with just this statement, you know, if the static being given to us exists or not. But we perform this extra step of making sure that it's not the same as the previous static, just in case. I do not know the implementation details of Formik. I don't know if it's possible for, you know, 2 renders to trigger with, you know, out the status object, you know, flipping back to undefined or not. In case we get 2 renders where it's the same object. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to reset it back to undefined when I used just checking this the props.status. And then I had to, you know, move it, you know, back to undefined.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I was just one. Yeah, okay.
Also, regarding the re-rendering, Henry, every time I did a console log in the component update, and every time like you type into the form, it triggers that component update.
Yes, and that's correct, because right when we do our managed forms, we manage the values of each input in our state. And so every time we type into there, we're calling this.setState, or, you know, its hook-based equivalent. And every time we call that function, we trigger a re-render. So we re-render this constantly. You can see here, you know, I have my console log set up. As I type in here, I just get flooded with all of these objects. And that is correct. And it may seem wasteful because that's a ton of re-rendering, but the idea of React and the virtual DOM is that it can check the output of our component and see the only difference is the contents of this single input, and then the only operations that actually happen in the DOM that is displayed to the user, the real DOM, is that the contents of this input update. So it does re-render a ton, but it's not a huge deal unless you're doing crazy computationally intensive things inside the render, which you should avoid doing, and try to split up your components where you can so you don't have a mega enormous component doing all this stuff. So, yeah, and that's why it's important that we have these conditionals inside of component did update, or we use our use effects, because we do not want these things to happen on every render. Okay, any more questions? I would like to, I know we've run into the afternoon project time. I would like to touch briefly on one of the stretches, though. So, any other questions with this? Okay. Well, the stretch that I would like to do is, where is it? Okay, add to your existing handling so that if the user inputs their email is waffle@syrup.com, they receive a message in their form saying that email is already taken. Because this, again, highlights this kind of flow of data between where Formik keeps all of its state and then our component as it receives the data as props. So one way to do this, which is the wrong way, but I want to touch on it here, is we could use yup to do this. We could say, well, it's got to be an email, and it's got to be required, but also it has to be not one of, I believe this is the correct function, it cannot be waffle at syrup.com, and if it is, then I want to give an error message saying this email is already taken. And this should work if I use the correct function. So if I type in here and I say waffle at syrup.com, I get my error message that this email is already taken. So there we go. I also realized why I'm getting all those errors. Is it because I did class name wrong? Yes, it is. When I did my find and replace, I changed class name to class email and class TOS, when this should still be class name. Okay. Those errors were driving me crazy, and I didn't want to divert from the topic at hand to fix them. But yeah, so now I get this error message via my validation schema. But the problem with this isn't dynamic. I thought I fixed that. Oh, I didn't fix this one. So this isn't dynamic. This is set up when I declare my component, and it's not going to change. So more than likely, what would happen is if we tried to register this user with the server would see, oh, that email's already taken, and it would send us an error message back. And we would have to handle that in the catch block of our submission. So what I would like to show is how we handle passing other data besides just status back down to our form in our submit handler. So could I use status for this? I could, yes. But in our Formik bag, we have a whole host of useful functions. One of them being set errors, which allows us to set the errors. We also have set field error, which allows us to set the error on a specific field. I'm just going to use set errors because it's more general. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check, and this is something you'd probably do in the catch block, where you would parse out the error that your endpoint had sent back to you, but we don't have that here. So I'm just going to do it as an if statement. So if the values.email is equal to waffles@syrup.com, then I want to call set errors, and I'm going to set the value of email's error to be email is already taken. I put the spaces in the wrong place. There we go. And it's an object because our errors object is an object. And if that is not my email, else, then I will do my post request. So now the way this should work is on submission, it will check my email. And if it matches waffles@syrup.com, it gives me my special error back, and it also doesn't reset my form. So that's another way of passing down data from our Formik functions down into our component, is with these various set functions. We have set status, which is kind of an all-purpose tool, but we also can leverage the existing data that we're expecting to get back from Formik with set errors. And you'll also see we have more functions like set touched. Set submitting is something that you can use to, trigger various loading effects if your submission process is running. And all of this good stuff. Documentation is good. Read it. All right. Do we have any questions with this? No? Are we feeling good about this? Anything else that you would like to see before we call it a day? All right. Well then, thank you all so much for coming. I have an absolute blast doing these.